Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started now. I've already taken attendance, and can everybody hear me? Okay, good, thank you. So welcome to ANP2, and this is a continuation, obviously, of ANP1, and many of you I've already had before, and so this part will be relatively straightforward. The syllabus is found in the content section of eLearn. Syllabus hasn't changed much from AP1. There are 5 lecture exams and 1 final exam for a total of 600 possible points. Everything is in eLearn. Everything is going to be, as far as the content goes, the PowerPoints and the PDFs are available for downloading, so you can take notes. The textbook is the OpenStax textbook. If you used it for AP1, you'll use it again for AP2. If you purchased a good used book somewhere, then that's fine. You know, they're all, pretty much all about the same, the textbooks anyway. So, and again, the exams are going to be online. You'll need to use the lockdown browser for the exam. There's a set of instructions included in eLearn in case you've forgotten how to do that, or if you're coming in from another class. Because I had to refresh myself every time I try to use the lockdown browser anyway. So let's see what else of interest here. We're going to spend a lot of time on organ systems. We're going to start with the endocrine system. The endocrine system will be the whole first unit. So the very first test we have, whenever we get to it, will be strictly on endocrine. Then we'll go to reproduction and pregnancy. And then from there, we'll go into heart, blood, and blood vessels. And then urinary system and fluid and electrolytes. And finish up with the immune system and lymphatic system. Oh, I'm sorry, immune system and respiratory system. We'll pick up lymphatics with part of the blood vessels. So Again, the immune system is still pretty topical. I was when we set the schedule for this class, we did it back in January, and at the time it seemed like virtual would be still the way to go because of the pandemic. Around May, we started thinking, well, gee, what are we going to do now? Because it looks like the pandemic's going away. Well, now that we've had the Delta come back, it seems like we were pretty astute to stay with the virtual. So, whatever. Now, lab will be this afternoon. We'll start the endocrine system in lab. It will also be virtual. And again, there will be one change in lab, and I'll tell you more about that, but we only have 3 exams instead of 4 in lab. So, any questions on anything? So, if you didn't get a textbook, again, I recommend, you don't have to. The eLearn OpenStax book is really good. It tracks pretty much along everybody else's platform for A&P books. But if you can get to Amazon or go to McKay's in Knoxville, they have lots of used A&P books there that aren't that old, and they're only about $10. Last time I was there was at Christmas, so that's been a while. But they nearly always have a big selection of those books. Let's see. Can't think of anything else. If you need to get a hold of me, send me an email. That's the easiest way. I may actually be on campus this semester with office hours. If days I go in, I'll let you know, because we'll still do everything virtual. I'll just do it from my office on campus. So. Let's see. Can everybody hear me except Brian? Okay. Brian. I've got my speakers up all the way on here. Okay. Well, like I said, I will also, I've said this before, but the lecture is being recorded. It'll be posted in YouTube. Hopefully the sound will work there if you can't hear it now. I don't know. Everybody else seems to be hearing me. So I don't know what to say. Oh, I got my volume up at 100% on both areas. So. Okay, let's open up. Should work now. And endocrine, where are we? There we go. Okay. Does everybody see the slide that says chapter 17, the endocrine system? Yes, no? Anybody?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. So, okay, then we're going to go ahead and get started on the endocrine system. Okay, our endocrine system, and I'm sure that you all remember from AP1 when we talked about the control systems of the body. The reason I said is I just got through going through that with the AP1 class earlier. There are two control systems in the body. One is the nervous system, which is instantaneous control, and the other is the endocrine system, which is long-term, slower control. It still maintains homeostasis. That word that I haven't used for a while. The endocrine system works in conjunction with the nervous system. The nervous system, of course, is instantaneous response. It's electrical. It has action potentials. Didn't think you were going to hear those words again for a while. The endocrine system is chemical. It takes longer to respond. It takes seconds to minutes, to hours, to days, to months, to years. It has a long duration effect. The endocrine system is all chemically based, slower response, longer duration. You can think about the classic negative feedback loop we talked about way back in AP1 in January about if you eat a donut and your blood sugar goes up, you release insulin to bring your blood sugar back down. That's classic negative feedback, and that's great, but that takes time. That is not an instantaneous response. Lowering blood sugar takes seconds to minutes to bring your blood sugar back down. If you eat a donut, if you eat an apple, if you eat a potato, if you eat any kind of carbohydrates and your blood sugar goes up, you will respond by releasing insulin to allow the cells to suck up the sugar and bring your blood sugar back to normal. Classic negative feedback, classic homeostasis. Takes about a half an hour for that to happen. So the endocrine system, it is slower. It's a chemically based system. It uses hormones. That's what we call the chemical messengers in here. We send messages. Yeah, maybe I should learn to speak. It sends messages out to the various cells in the body from glands and tells certain cells to do things. And as long as that chemical messenger is there, I got the word out right that time, the cell will continue to function or do what it's supposed to do. So these hormones are large molecules, different types of molecules. They're chemical messengers. They help control our metabolic activity. They control growth and reproduction. Sleep cycles, for example. All of these activities that are going to be long duration activities, even half an hour is long duration as well as the way the body is concerned. So, and the topic area then is called endocrinology. So if you're going to study hormones and how they affect the body, then the whole science behind it is called endocrinology. Endocrinology, the endocrine system brings together reproduction. It stimulates the production of eggs from the ovary, from sperm, from the testes. It controls growth and development. When we hit puberty, we start going through a more rapid growth cycle to reach our adult stature. It maintains our water and salt levels in our bodies as well as our glucose, our sugar levels too. It helps to control metabolic activity. And it can also, the endocrine system also brings together our body defenses. So while it is a slower process, it is much longer lasting. Now the hormones are released from glands that do not have any kind of ductwork. So that's, an endocrine gland has no duct. An exocrine gland, like the mammary glands have ducts that release milk. It has a sweat gland has a duct. An oil gland has a duct, a tube leading to the surface. But endocrine glands are different. An endocrine gland releases the hormone directly into the blood supply. So no duct. And they can have a systemic action or a localized action on a specific organ. So these are the hormones then are going to travel through the blood or through the lymphatic system to reach their target cells. We have another type of chemical messenger called autocrines, which act on the cells that release them. So, for example, if you remember the Golgi apparatus, Golgi apparatus packages up proteins to be released. Some of the proteins stay there. Some go into the lysosomes. Some get released. They can act directly on the cells that are releasing them. Paracrines are a chemical messenger that act on nearby cells, not the ones that release them, but on nearby cells. And the textbooks go back and forth. Are they really hormones or not? Because they're not long distance. Well, we're not going to engage in that kind of discussion. We don't need to. Hormones, autocrines, and paracrines. Paracrines are local cells. Autocrines are acting on themselves. So as I said, endocrine glands are the ductless glands. Hormones go into the blood supply. They go into the lymphatic fluid. Lymphatic fluid is water that leaks out of blood vessels. Now our blood is made up of plasma. That's the fluid part. That's the salty, 45%, 50% of our blood is salt water, and the other 50% more or less is going to be red blood cells with a little bit of white cells and platelets thrown in there. Well, that watery fluid leaks out of our blood vessels. Our capillaries are very leaky, and fluid leaks out, and it becomes interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that surrounds the cells. It's the outside of the cells. You have water in the cells, water outside cells. That's the interstitial between the cells fluid. Now we have to get that water back into the plasma. So that interstitial fluid is collected by a series of vessels cleverly called lymphatic vessels. It's a parallel circulatory system. The fluid, once it moves in there, is no longer interstitial fluid, but now it's lymph. And it's clear and watery. But before we bring it back to the blood and it becomes plasma, we filter it through lymph nodes. We all know about lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are those, when you're sick and you go to your doctor and the doctor says, oh, your glands are swollen, or you feel a bump underneath in your axillary region. Your lymph nodes are the location where we filter out our lymph that we're returning back to our plasma. And that's where our white cells, the infection fighting cells, tend to hang out. And they're literally looking for something to kill in there. They won't hurt cell tissue, stuff that belongs to us. But if it's pathogenic, if it's a foreign substance, then they'll go after it. Okay, I digress. The endocrine glands, what are they? Well, we have the pituitary gland, often called the master gland of the body because it releases 8 different types of hormones. It makes 6 of it itself and stores 2 other hormones, so it releases 8 different hormones. It's found in the sella turcica in the skull. Remember the sella turcica from AP1 lab? So we have the pituitary gland, we have the thyroid gland located in our neck, just above that little depression above the top of the sternum. We have the parathyroid gland on the back side of the thyroid. We have the adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys. The pineal gland is a little gland that dangles down just above the cerebellum in the brain at the end at the base of the thalamus. And we have the thymus gland. The thymus gland is found in the middle of our chest. It was quite large when we were young. It's where white blood cells, the lymphocytes, white blood cell lymphocytes that go there to become immunocompetent. Now, only half of them go there. Only half the lymphocytes that may go to the thymus gland to become immunocompetent. We call them T cells or T lymphocytes. The other half of the lymphocytes become immunocompetent. That means capable of fighting an infection in the bone marrow. We call them B lymphocytes or B cells. We have T cells and B cells. We'll get all into that when we get into the immune system. The pancreas functions as an endocrine gland. It also functions as an exocrine gland too, because it has a big pancreatic duct releasing digestive enzymes in the small intestine. So it does both endocrine and exocrine. The ovaries and testes are both endocrine and exocrine. They release testosterone, they release estrogen, but they also release eggs and sperm. They have ducts for that. So they have a very strong endocrine component there. The hypothalamus tends to be the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. I remember from the nervous system that you have the thalamus, which is the thalamus looks like 2 eggs paired side by side at the top of the diencephalon, which is, if you imagine a mushroom, the stalk that holds up the cap of the mushroom, the stalk is the diencephalon, and the cap are the cerebral hemispheres. The hypothalamus is the link, is right below the thalamus, and it's the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, because the hypothalamus essentially controls the pituitary gland. So we have, that's that nervous system link between the endocrine system, taking place right there between, I mean, consider this. Consider when we go into a fight or flight response. Everybody remembers fight or flight from AP1. Fight or flight. We stand and fight or we run away. We breathe faster. We release more glucose for energy. We route circulation to our heart, lungs, brain, muscles, and we forget the skin. We forget the stomach and the reproductive system and the digestive system and the urinary system, all this other stuff, so that we can focus on fight or flight. Well, what tells us to do that? Well, the hypothalamus, the brain is telling us to respond that way. The limbic system is telling us to respond that way. And the hypothalamus is sending signals out, hey, here's what we got to do. And it's telling the adrenal glands to dump out lots and lots of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are hormones. So we get that response. We release lots of glucose. We dilate certain blood vessels and we constrict other blood vessels. So we have this massive response for fight or flight. The chemical response, giving us glucose for energy, increased blood flow, increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, opening up the airways, restricting blood flow to areas where we don't need it. And this is all thanks to the information coming from the hypothalamus to the adrenal glands. So, did you know that our heart also secretes hormones? There is a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. That's why we call it ANP, because it's a mouthful. It slows down the heart rate if our blood pressure gets too high. It's our part of our body's check and balance to try and maintain homeostasis. Our kidneys produce two different hormones. We produce erythropoietin to stimulate blood cell production in the bone marrow. And we produce a substance known as renin to raise our blood pressure when necessary. So a lot of our organs have very specialized and localized endocrine functions taking place in here. So there's our endocrine system. You can see the pineal gland, very poor illustration here, but the pineal gland sort of hangs down back in here. If you remember the corpora quadrigemina slides from AP1 lab, directly above the corpora quadrigemina is the pineal gland dangling down below there. That's pineal gland produces a hormone that regulates our day and night cycles. So we have the pineal gland, we have the hypothalamus directly below the thalamus, we have the pituitary gland, which is directly below the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland here in our neck, parathyroid glands on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland, our thymus located here. As an adult, our thymus gland's pretty small. When we were infants, it was very large. We have the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidneys, our pancreas right here tucked up underneath the left side of our stomach, and then we have the ovaries in the female and testes in the male to produce testosterone or estrogen. So in addition to their ductwork for releasing sperm cells and releasing the egg cells. Okay. For a hormone to work, it has to have a target cell. You can't just release a hormone into our blood supply and just let it go working everywhere. The hormones are specific. Now, some hormones will work on every cell in the body. Thyroid hormone released by the thyroid gland acts on every cell in the body because it helps to stimulate metabolic activity. However, thyroid stimulating hormone released by the pituitary gland only acts on the thyroid gland. Now, it will circulate throughout the body. A thyroid stimulating hormone will circulate throughout the body, but it will only act on the thyroid gland because the thyroid gland is the only place that has target cells. Target cells have unique receptors, and they're only going to work. That thyroid stimulating hormone will only land on the target cells in the thyroid. It won't do anything if it lands in the adrenal glands. It won't do anything if it lands on muscle cells or nerve cells or any other cell in the body because there are no receptors there for it. It only works on cells. It only works on structures with the correct target cell. And the only target cells we have for thyroid stimulating hormone are found in the thyroid gland itself. Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine, for example, can act on smooth muscle. It can act on smooth muscle around blood vessels. It can act on smooth muscle around the airway. It can act on smooth muscle around the digestive system. It can also act on cardiac muscle. So we see, while it doesn't act on every cell, it acts on a lot of cells because the target cells are there. So the hormones are going to be specific to their appropriate target cells. And it's the target cells that get turned on or turned off. If the target cell is a smooth muscle cell, then epinephrine and norepinephrine can land on it and either cause it to vasoconstrict, meaning shrink, or vasodilate, meaning get bigger. So we can see these changes here. Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine aren't going to do anything to skin cells. Probably not a lot, if anything. So we're going to see hormones only work when there's a target cell there to receive them. When the hormone lands on the target cell, it will cause channels, ion channels. Remember ion channels? When it lands on a target cell, and it's the correct target cell, then certain channels, ion channels, will open up or they'll close. Maybe it's a sodium channel will open up. Maybe it's a sodium channel will close. Maybe it's a potassium channel that will open or close. So we alter the permeability of these ion channels. And why am I saying sodium and potassium? Well, because it's usually, that's a pretty common type of ion channel. So we see that action taking place. We can see increased protein synthesis. How about we release growth hormone onto bone cells? Well, our bones grow. When we go through puberty, we ultimately reach our adult body stature. Growth hormone stimulates bone growth. It stimulates muscle cell growth. Doesn't make new muscle cells, but it makes the muscle cells we have get bigger. So we see, increased protein synthesis taking place here. We can turn on or turn off certain enzymes to function. So we can activate or deactivate enzyme systems. Are we going to, let me think of a good example here. Which is totally escaping me at the point. I'll probably remember it in a second here. We can secrete. What triggers the release of an egg? Why does an ovary ovulate an egg on the 14th day of the ovarian cycle? Because it's always the 14th day. And it's always the 14th day because we designate whatever day ovulation occurs as the 14th day, because it takes 14 days then before menstruation will start. That's a pretty, it could have been the 12th day of the ovarian cycle, or the 16th day or whatever, but from the point of ovulation of an egg to menstruation starting is generally always 14 days. So anyway, we can turn on or turn off secretion. We can stimulate mitosis. We can stimulate cell division and mitosis and cell division for growth. We won't see muscle cells do that. We'll see bone cells do it. We'll see skin cells grow. We'll see connective tissue grow and undergo mitosis. We won't see nerve cells do it. But when we go through puberty, or when we have normal wear and tear, or we'll stimulate production of blood cells in the bone marrow. The red blood cells are controlled by the hormone erythropoietin coming out of the kidneys. So erythropoietin is a hormone that acts on bone marrow. We produce red blood cells thanks to that. So all these things are going to be happening here thanks to the effect of the hormones. And again, it comes down to the target cell. Where is the target cell? And what are you doing to the target cell? Now, there are basically two types of hormones. They are either going to be amino acid based, meaning they're made up of a bunch of amino acids linked together to make a peptide. Remember, amino acids from AP1. Most of the hormones in our bodies are going to be amino acid based. The thyroid hormone is amino acid based. The protein hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, for example, are amino acid based. The water-soluble hormones are all amino acid based. Most of our hormones are going to be amino acid derived, and they're big, they're large. And since they're large and water soluble, they can't get into the cells. They're too big to get through the cell membrane. And even if they weren't too big, they're water soluble, and cells don't like water soluble things. Water doesn't come through easily. It has to have its own little channel. So amino acid based hormones, which make up the bulk of our hormones, are very large and they're watery. Two strikes against them for getting into the cells. Now, the steroid hormones are easy. They're based off of cholesterol. They slide right through the cell membrane because they're fat soluble. They go right through. They're usually smaller. The testosterones and the estrogens that are produced are going to be steroid hormones. The hormones produced by the outer layer of our adrenal glands, we call them the adrenocortical hormones. There are three layers of the outer cortex of the adrenal gland has 3 layers, and each layer produces a different type of hormone. We have what's known as aldosterone, cortisol, you may have heard of cortisol, and androgens, the sort of the non-specific sex hormone. Actually, it's more of a testosterone-derived hormone. So these 3, the adrenocorticotropic hormones, plus the testosterone and estrogen, are going to be the steroid-based hormones. They slide right into the cell with no trouble whatsoever. So they're not that big, and they are fat soluble. But you can see that the bulk of the hormones are going to be amino acid based. Now, the problem here is that the water soluble hormones, the big, long amino acid based hormones, can't get into the cell. They need to act on the cell, but whatever they're going to do, they can't get into the cell to do it because they're too big and they're based on, they're soluble in water. They will act on a receptor on the plasma membrane, but they have to use what's known as a second messenger. The second messenger is the only, it's the only way to get these, to send the information into the interior of the cell. The large hormone is the first messenger, can't get in. It just won't go in through the cell membrane. So it has to pass its information on to a second messenger, which is embedded in the membrane and will then transfer that information to the interior of the cell. And we call this the G protein second messenger. So can't get the hormone can't get in. The second messenger is already embedded in the membrane and it can send the information into the cell. So we have a problem, and we have a good workaround here for the water-based, amino acid-based hormones, water-soluble hormones. Now, as I said, the fat-soluble, the lipid-soluble hormones slide right through, and thyroid hormone can slide right through. It's not fat-soluble. It's not a fat-soluble hormone, but it can slide right through the membrane because it has to affect every cell. And so when the fat-soluble hormones can slide through the membrane, they can act directly on the cell to turn on or turn off certain genes in the DNA to do things. Make this, stop making this, start making this type of stuff. So these, they can stimulate various activities, or they can shut down certain activities. Consider estrogen. When estrogen stops being produced, then there are certain physiological changes in the ovary. Ovary stops producing eggs. That's a physiological change. When estrogen levels rise, ovaries start to produce eggs on a monthly cycle. So that's it, and that's a fat-soluble, a lipid-soluble hormone. So if you are a protein-based hormone, you can't get in there. You have to use your second messenger. Now, there are two types of second messenger systems. One is called Cyclic AMP. That is the #1 mechanism that these peptide-based hormones use. Cyclic AMP. This is how we get around the fact that these protein hormones are large and water soluble. It's our workaround. So you have cyclic AMP, and then there's another one called PIP calcium. And I'll explain that one here in a second. So cyclic AMP, the hormone, let's say it's epinephrine, lands on, in fact, that's the hormone that this was all discovered with. Epinephrine lands on the surface of the cell, lands on the target cell. Maybe it's smooth muscle, I don't know. The epinephrine, the hormone, is the first messenger. It binds to a receptor on the target cell. That receptor turns on an embedded G protein in the membrane. The G protein turns on or turns off an effector enzyme. And in this particular case, the enzyme is called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase turns on cyclic AMP. It converts ATP, which happens to be always available, into cyclic AMP, CAMP. That's the second messenger. And cyclic AMP, which is now inside the cell membrane, activates certain enzymes, protein kinases, that act on other proteins inside the cytoplasm. And these proteins are either turned on or turned off. Yeah, it's a lot of steps, but it works. So the large hormone lands on the cell membrane, on the target cell membrane. It activates the receptor it binds to. Turns on a G protein. The G protein turns on or turns off adenylate cyclase, which then produces cyclic AMP, which then turns on certain enzymes. We call them protein kinases. We know it's an enzyme because it has that enzyme ending that add phosphates to other proteins, which then either turn on or turn off those proteins. And then the cell does something. It could, like, for example, in epinephrine and smooth muscle, it contracts it, or it dilates it, it either expands it, or it relaxes it, or it contracts it. That's what it does. Whether it's in the airway or the digestive system or in the blood vessels, whatever it's going to do, wherever it's going to act, that's what it does. So now, since most of us are visual, this is an much easier way to look at it. Up here at the top, you can see the epinephrine landing here. I don't think it's shaped like a teardrop. And it lands on its specialized receptor site there just for epinephrine. Landing on that receptor causes the receptor to turn on the G protein. The G protein turns on the adenylyl cyclase embedded in the membrane. And that activates the cyclic AMP, which activates the protein kinases, which then add a phosphate to a protein and either turns them on or turns them off. And so if you want to see the animation, it's down here. Here's the receptor. The yes. Okay. There's the hormone landing there. There's the receptor. We produce there's the G protein activating the adenylate cyclase, which produces the cyclic AMP at the expense of ATP. And there's the cyclic AMP, which is going to now act on the protein kinases there. And we're going to end up with turning on or turning off something. So what do you have to remember? Cyclic AMP is the most common type for your protein-based hormones. It involves the production of protein kinases from, it uses a G protein. So, and most amino acid-based hormones use this. The other mechanism is the PIP2 calcium. It doesn't use adenylate cyclase. It uses something called phospholipase C. And phospholipase C forms two second messengers. The phospholipase C splits PIP2 into diaglycerol and IP3, because I don't like saying it. Inositol triphosphate is hard to say, so it's IP3. This causes the release of calcium. So when we release, this causes the release of a lot of calcium in here. The PIP3 mechanism, the PIP calcium mechanism causes the release of calcium. Where might we see calcium? Let's see. Perhaps at muscle contractions, for example, opening up calcium channels in axon terminals, calcium channels in the heart, for example. All these are different, unique mechanisms that involve the release of calcium. And calcium then turns on, when it does get released, it turns on a protein called calmodulin. And the calmodulin turns on further enzymes. So fortunately, there's only a couple hormones that use this PIP calcium mechanism, and we'll talk about those here, because most of the other amino acid hormones are going to use cyclic AMP. Now, if you are a steroid-based hormone, a lipid-soluble hormone, if you're a thyroid hormone, you slide right through the cell membrane without any trouble. You bind to receptor sites that go straight to DNA, the DNA in the cell, in the nucleus. And what this does is it makes new proteins. When your steroid hormone slides across the membrane and binds to the DNA, it triggers the production of messenger RNA, which directs the production of new proteins. That's what these do. So much simpler approach, because the steroid hormones are lipid soluble, they're fat soluble, they slide through the membrane. Thyroid hormone does the same thing. And so there's your lipid soluble hormone in the blood vessel. It slides out, leaves there, it goes into the cell, it binds to its receptor and goes into the nucleus. It affects the DNA, and the DNA makes new messenger RNA to produce a new protein through transcription and translation. Now, there is one exception here. Insulin, which is amino acid based, doesn't use a second messenger. Insulin's the ringer here. Because insulin's job is to simply open up channels. Insulin's job is to open up channels to allow glucose to enter cells. So insulin, which is a peptide amino acid based hormone, insulin that will bind to an enzyme known as tyrosine kinase. And this opens up glucose channels in the cell membrane. And we probably talked about this back in AP1. We talked about the different channels, the carrier proteins and the channel proteins. And it's likely that the inability to get glucose into the cells, failure of insulin to do its job, is a failure of producing enough carrier proteins for glucose to come through. And so this is what's happening here. Insulin binds to this enzyme called tyrosine kinase, and that enzyme causes glucose channels to open up, and we get our glucose into the cell. So insulin is the ringer on that one. Now, so we know that hormones only work on target cells. The target cells have got to have a unique receptor for them. It's like a lock and a key, if you will. It's like certain enzymes only work on certain substrates. You have to have a lock and a key. Now, the receptor doesn't have to be on the plasma membrane. It can be inside the cell. And these receptors can be very, very specific. These adrenocorticotropic hormones I mentioned earlier, the aldosterones and the cortisols and the androgens, their receptors are not evenly distributed throughout the outer layer of the adrenal glands. They are embedded all through the layers of the adrenal glands. So the cells have, to stimulate production of these hormones, you have to move into the cells, not just in the surface cells, you have to go into the cells. The same with thyroid hormone. The receptor sites for thyroid hormone are internal. The thyroid hormone goes into every cell. So we have a lot of receptors on the surface. We have a lot of receptors within the cell proper. Now, for a target cell to become activated, three things have to come into play. How much hormone do you have? Have you produced enough hormone? Are the blood levels of the hormone adequate? Are you producing enough insulin? Are you producing enough estrogen or testosterone? What are the blood levels of the hormone? Is there enough there to do the job? How many target cells do you have, and how many receptors do you have on the target cells? Because the strength of the target cell is dependent on how many receptors there are and how strong is the bond forms between the receptor and the hormone. And that's, what is the strength of the receptor? Is it a strong bond or is it a weak bond? So 3 things. How much hormone do you have? How many receptors do you have on the target cell? And how strong is the bond between the receptors and the hormone? Now, there's 2 mechanisms that can work here. We have what's known as upregulation and downregulation. The target cells do have a couple of tools they can use. Upregulation. If we have low levels of hormone, the target cells can respond by making more receptors. More receptors gives, if you don't have a lot of hormone being produced, you can still get the same amount of activity if you have a lot more receptors to grab what little bit's there. I don't want to sound like a little bit, but if you're not producing an adequate amount of a specific hormone, your target cells can make more receptors, so that while you may not be releasing a lot of hormone, you can still get them to function by having a lot of receptor sites to flood so you can get a lot of action going there at once. That's one response. When we have, excuse me, so we may be producing lower levels of hormone, but we can still respond by having more receptor sites. Now, downregulation is exactly what it sounds like. If we are producing an overabundance of a hormone, a cell can try to maintain homeostasis by reducing the number of receptors that are present. So we may have lots, in this case, we have producing way too many, well, I shouldn't say that. With downregulation, we may be very generous in producing our hormone. Well, the target cell says, no, we don't need that much. So I'm only going to have a few receptor sites. Consider type 2 diabetes. An individual with type 2 diabetes is producing insulin that is generally not recognized or non-responsive. So a person with type 2 diabetes has developed, type 2 diabetes is usually considered adult onset. So your individual that has adult onset diabetes is probably producing lots of insulin in response to, let me say this carefully. The average individual with adult onset diabetes has usually maintained a high fat, high carbohydrate diet and has consistently produced high levels of insulin to respond to those high levels of blood sugar. That's what's produced, insulin gets released when the blood sugar goes up. So producing high quantities of insulin in response to high levels of blood sugar. Okay. Well, over time, the target cells may stop recognizing a lot of that insulin because they've been exposed to it for so long. The pancreas is still producing lots of insulin because of the high levels of blood sugar, but the cells aren't getting supplied. The cells are not receiving their glucose. Remember what insulin does. Insulin triggers the production of channels for glucose to get into the cell. That's what insulin does. Insulin stimulates the production of carrier protein channels to allow glucose to enter the cell. And if you don't have adequate amounts of glucose being recognized by the cell, then you're not going to get those channels for glucose to enter, because glucose is too big to come in through the cell membrane on its own. So a person with type 2 diabetes with high blood sugar levels is consistent. Well, prior to the development of type 2 diabetes, their high blood sugar levels has caused them to produce lots of insulin. Well, after a while, the cells may get tired of that, and they may start down-regulating and making less receptors. And if so, then they're not going to get the channels open that they need to get the glucose into the cell. And so your type 2 diabetic is often will often run with a high blood glucose, running a high blood glucose level, and yet the cells are starving. So down-regulation, this is up-regulation. Now, this is how we try to respond to low levels of our hormone. We simply increase the number of receptor sites. But down-regulation, we reduce, if the hormone levels are elevated, we reduce the number of receptor sites. And this is likely what's happening in type 2 diabetes. Because there's so much insulin, the cells have grown tired of responding. And so they down-regulate, trying to control the amount of glucose going into the cell. Because that excess, the more glucose that goes into a cell, the more that leftover sugar, not all the sugar is going to get used in the cell. And what isn't used is going to end up becoming stored as fat in adipose tissue. So what the cell is trying to do is trying to reduce the amount of sugar coming in, and then not recognizing the insulin at all. So how long does a hormone last? Well, it depends. Hormones have a half-life. That's a half-life is how long does it take for something to decrease by half. We refer to half-life and talking about radioactive particles and things like that. But we also have activity of the hormone. We can look at the half-life of the hormone. It can be very short, it can be very long. It just depends. Enzymes break down the hormone, break down the second messengers very quickly. The liver and kidneys will get rid of the extra hormone quickly. We get rid of it through urine, we get rid of it through feces. Insulin levels can be detected in urine if they're elevated. Sugar levels can be detected in urine if they're elevated. If we're not getting sugar in, we should see no sugar in our urine. If we do, there's something going on. It's an indicator. It might be an indicator that something's going on, and it might not be. But how long does a hormone last in our bodies? Well, it's usually fairly short, but it just depends. Now, the activity of the hormone fluctuates. It also depends on what hormone it is, what it's acting on, how much did you produce. We get immediate responses on some things and slower responses on others. Insulin, when insulin comes out from the pancreas, it will start acting on the cells immediately, opening up channels to let glucose go into the cells in a healthy individual. That's an immediate response. It does take a little bit of time. It's not like the nervous system responds. Steroid responses are different, however. Hours to days, for example. Consider that estrogen will be active for about 40 to 50 years in the female ovary. Testosterone will be active from the onset of puberty till death in the testes. They will act for years. um, puberty. Going through puberty takes several years at least to reach our adult stature. And that's driven by the presence of the steroid hormones. That is a multi-year event as we go through that. Yeah, so the response time can be very long duration. It can be very short. It can be 10 seconds. It can be hours if it's, we're talking short-term response. So depending on what the hormone is, the actions can last for quite a while. They can be very short, or they can last for a long time. That's a real squishy answer, but that's just the way it is. We do know that all of our hormone response is controlled through negative feedback. Remember negative feedback from AP1, negative feedback. We have a stimulus and we respond to the stimulus by trying to reverse the stimulus. Blood sugar goes up, we release insulin to bring the blood sugar down. Blood sugar goes up because there's sugar, there's glucose in our plasma, and it's not going into the cells, so we release insulin to open up the cells, the carrier protein channels in the cells to let glucose come in. Glucose goes into the cell, blood sugar levels drop, and then we stop releasing insulin. Cells are happy, pancreas is happy, blood levels for sugar are happy. So this is negative feedback to control this. And it works very, very well in a healthy individual. Negative feedback is triggered by one of 3 different mechanisms. We have what's known as humoral stimulus. Glucose, blood sugar, is a good example of this humoral stimulus. Blood sugar goes up, we release insulin to bring it back down. Calcium levels go down. We release calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Blood calcium levels in our blood go down, so we release parathyroid hormone to dissolve bone to raise calcium levels. Or calcium levels get too high, unlikely, but possible, and we release calcitonin to build more bone. Calcitonin is not a big player in this. That's a humoral stimulus. Blood calcium levels and glucose. We've talked, I think I've beaten glucose into the ground here with insulin, but that's the classic negative feedback, but it's also the great example of a humoral stimulus, as is calcium. Calcium levels in the blood can fluctuate up and down. Now, the number 1 hormone that regulates blood calcium is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone stimulates bone breakdown, and we get calcium out. That's a humoral stimulus. A neural stimulus goes back to fight or flight. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion of the adrenal gland, can receive a signal from the hypothalamus, telling it to produce lots of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Why are we saying epinephrine and norepinephrine? Well, it used to be called adrenaline. Adrenaline was a substance released from the adrenal glands. Well, it turns out that adrenaline is made up of both epinephrine and norepinephrine. So now to be more specific, we say epinephrine and norepinephrine. They have different actions. They can be vasoconstrictive, meaning they can shrink blood vessels. They can vasodilate other blood vessels. They can speed up the heart rate. They can open up the airway. They can constrict the airway. So there's all sorts of, there's different things here. We'll talk about their role a little later on. So it isn't adrenaline anymore. It's epinephrine and norepinephrine. And the adrenal medulla, the middle portion of the adrenal glands, are under the control of the hypothalamus. That's that neural endocrine link again. The nervous system says fight or flight, stand and fight or run away. So let's release some epinephrine and norepinephrine to meet that need. So that's the neural stimulus. The hormonal stimulus is triggered when the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone. The hypothalamus will generate a hormone that acts on the pituitary gland. And the hormone coming out of the pituitary gland will act on another organ. For example, thyroid stimulating hormone comes out of the pituitary gland and acts on the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. That's a hormonal stimulus. The hypothalamus detected that thyroid hormone levels were too low. So the hypothalamus told the pituitary gland, make thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone was released from the pituitary, acted on the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produced thyroid hormone, and that raised the thyroid hormone levels in blood. Hypothalamus is happy. Plus, we're getting more energy through, we're having more metabolic activity thanks to the increased levels of thyroid hormone. So that is hormonal stimulus. Humoral stimulus, think calcium and glucose. Neural stimulus, the adrenal medulla being acted on to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And hormonal stimulus, think the hypothalamus and telling the pituitary gland to make thyroid stimulating hormone, for example. And here are examples of all this. Humoral stimulus. There's our thyroid gland and our parathyroid gland. Parathyroid gland, remember the parathyroid gland secretes parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone stimulates bone breakdown to raise calcium levels. So if calcium levels get too low, we're going to break some bone and dissolve it and get the calcium. That's a humoral stimulus. And then of course you have glucose and insulin. The neural stimulus, there's our medulla right there. And we're telling our medulla to make epinephrine and norepinephrine right here. And that comes out and affects us in a fight or flight, for example. And then here's the hypothalamus telling the pituitary gland to make some thyroid stimulating hormone to act on the thyroid gland, for example. Now, okay, I'm going to call it a day here. And I'll do attendance. I got everybody's attendance as you came into the waiting room there. I'm going to shut us down. This will be posted in YouTube later today, so you can look at it again and again if you really feel the need to. And in lab this afternoon, we'll be taking a look at some of these endocrine organs and some of the slides to go with that. So if you have any questions, let's see, what is it? When you're injected with epinephrine, well, epinephrine, depending on what it's acting on, the target organ, a person who is having a reaction like to a bee sting, the response to a bee sting causes blood vessels to dilate and get very, very, very large, and blood flow slows down, and fluid is leaking out, rapidly into, those leaky capillaries are letting more plasma leak out of the tissues. So what epinephrine would do there is cause those vessels to tighten up, to constrict. And so, because you've been stung by a bee, your blood vessels are going to dilate, your blood pressure is dropping, your heart's beating faster because it's not getting enough blood. So the epinephrine causes the blood vessels to constrict, raises your blood pressure back to normal, and your heart's getting the blood supply it needs. So that's what epinephrine does for us. Now, I was trying to download the token has expired. Well, that's a new one to me. Let me check the PowerPoints and eLearn, and I'll get back to you. I'll see if I can get that fixed, because it should be there. So that's a new one on me. I'll get that fixed. So, any other questions? Okay, that's great. I love questions. You know that. Those of you that have me in AP1 know that. So, okay, I'll see you in lab then at it wouldn't let you on Safari. Okay, yeah, probably stick to Chrome. So, but I'll look into it. So, okay, I'm gonna pull the plug and I'll see you at 1 o'clock.